Hello, welcome to the Clean Air Task Force Zero Carbon Future Pavilion. My name is Olivia Azadegan. I lead our Middle East North Africa work, and I'm delighted to welcome you all today to this exciting event, Reimagining Global Energy Markets for a Zero Carbon Future. A very warm welcome to our two keynote speakers that we have today, Vicki, Hollub, CEO of Occidental Petroleum, who will provide some opening reflections. And our second keynote speaker, Tim Gold, the Chief Economist at the International Energy Agency. I'm also delighted to welcome our panelists for today's discussion as well. We have Arshad Mansoor, President and CPO of EPRI. Welcome. We also have Simon Benmarraze, who is Analyst of Technology and Infrastructure at IRENA, the International Renewable Agency. And we also have Yukihiro Kawaguchi, the Director for Carbon Neutrality for Manufacturing at METI in Japan. We also have Julio Friedmann, Chief Scientist of Carbon Direct, who should be joining us shortly. But before we hand over, hi Julio. Before I hand over to our keynote speakers and our distinguished panel, I just wanted to set some context for this event as we gather here in Egypt for this very exciting COP. As we drawn here today to discuss what are the different technologies, incentives that countries are doing to rise to meet the decarbonization challenge. And the reason that we wanted to pull this panel together today is due to the fact that each region will have different pathways, different technologies, have different priorities that will be needed to achieve our collective decarbonization goals. And really what we want to be highlighting here is that the energy system is globally interconnected, and it's critical that the world moves away from the current unabated fossil fuel energy sources to a world where we're seeing zero carbon alternatives across all sectors. So this event is seeking to elevate the understanding of what those different priorities are, and what are the realities, both practically, technically, economically, for making this happen. And our speakers are working on all sides of the globe to make this happen, and COP brings us the opportunity to highlight some of these different pathways, these different technologies, what are the import requirements, the export production requirements. So very excited to have this discussion today. So today we operate in a very interconnected energy market with fuels currently delivering about 80% of final energy use, and they will remain a very important component in a decarbonized world, as fuels will be needed for decarbonizing the most challenging to decarbonize sectors. So these are things like heavy industry, heavy transport, and these need to switch from high-emitting fuels to these decarbonized alternatives. A McKinsey 2050 study projects that this will contribute to about 20% of our global emissions reduction. And at Clean Air Task Force, we're playing a role in accelerating the deployment of these zero carbon fuels alternatives, such as hydrogen and ammonia on a policy level. So global cooperation, ambitious innovation policy, infrastructure, market creation, transparency will all be needed to effect this transformation and move away from the existing trade paradigm. So looking at where we are today, the map that you can see is showing you the global oil and gas trade flows. So this one is taken from BP, and it is important to note that this is before the recent developments with Russia and Ukraine. But largely, this is showing what the current trade flows are and where some of the largest oil and gas exporting and importing regions are. And the second is showing what the oil trade flows are worldwide. And as we can see, natural gas imports, Europe is a region with the highest imports, followed by China and Japan. So with a decarbonized energy market, we're always looking at interdependency, partnerships, imports, exports, and an interdependency of the different systems. So importing economies such as Europe and Asia will need to catalyze decarbonized energy markets by stimulating the demand for these decarbonized fuels. Europe is importing about 80% currently of its energy and will likely remain a net importer. Same for Asia. They're likely to continue to remain to be importers. And most importantly, decarbonized energy is going to be needed to be imported into developing nations to enable them to also develop and have access to energy. And then nations with substantial oil and gas reserves are well positioned to lead in the production as we begin to shift towards this decarbonized market. So the projection that is up on the board is an arena of what a potential decarbonized energy system could look like. And there are many examples of how this could look. But this is, the point here is that there's interconnectedness of this market. And therefore, to decarbonize, we need to build partnerships, we need to build alliances, and we need to build a common understanding of what different countries' priorities are in order to drive this energy transition and pull together these conversations and support with cooperation. So with that, I'd like to turn to our panelists. But before we do that, our keynote speaker, Vicki, Hollub, to discuss what will be needed to accelerate the decarbonization of the energy system. Thank you.
Thank you. What I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about what our strategy is, where we stand, what our status is of that strategy, and why the strategy, I think, is really important for the climate transition. So first of all, I'll just say that our strategy is really based on our core competence, which is the use of CO2 and enhanced oil recovery. We've done that for 50 years. We're still the largest handler of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery in the world. And building on that experience with CO2, our strategy really is to get anthropogenic or atmospheric CO2 and extract that and reduce the amount that's coming out of industrial sites and that's currently in the air, and use that CO2, either sequester it or use it in enhanced oil recovery or convert it to fuels. And so we have all three of those strategies that are a part of what we want to do. Where we are right now is that we have 400 square miles of sequestration sites in the United States in 5 different locations, totaling 6 billion metric tons of storage capacity in those sequestration sites. And in addition to that, we're going to be building direct air capture in the Permian Basin and sequestering it, and some of it in saline reservoirs, but some of it in enhanced oil recovery reservoirs. And this direct air capture technology is kind of the basis of our strategy too. It's not just putting capture on emission sites, although we'll do some of that. A big part of it is building direct air capture on a large scale, which is not being done today. Climeworks, I think, has the largest facility that's extracting CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's 4,000 tons a year in Iceland. And I applaud them because they've been pretty progressive and proactive around doing that. So give them some kudos for that. But what we need to do is to build direct air capture on a much larger scale. We believe we're not only uniquely positioned to do that because of the fact that we know how to handle CO2, we know how it works in an underground reservoir, whether it's enhanced oil recovery or saline, we can model that and we can make that work. But the other thing is we have a synergy with our chemicals business because in this technology, the fluid that extracts the CO2 out of the atmosphere is potassium hydroxide, and we're the largest marketer of potassium hydroxide in the US, second largest in the world. And the way you make it work more efficiently is you have to diffuse that in a contact tower, and you have to get a good blend and mix of the potassium hydroxide with the atmosphere, with the air. So you get that by putting diffusers in there, which is going to be PVC, and we make PVC. We're building the first one in the Permian Basin because we have infrastructure in the Permian Basin. So all of that helps to reduce the cost of the first plant built. That will give us a jump start on building more of this technology as we go. Currently, our plan is to build 100 direct air capture facilities before 2035 or by 2035. So with the first one being a bit smaller, 500,000 tons per year, versus what we'll build after that, which will be 1 million tons per year, that means we will by 2035, we'll be extracting 99.5 million tons a year out of the atmosphere. So it's pretty significant. And the thing that we wanted to talk about today is while we can sequester, and we'll do a lot of sequestration, and we can convert it to fuels, and that's important. But the thing I think is most important for the climate transition is to understand how using CO2 in an oil reservoir works and is beneficial for the transition. Because if you look at the cost of the transition, where do the funds come from? How do we make that happen? I have concerns that because of the cost, it's going to be hard to pull off a strategy for the world where we can limit global warming to even 2 degrees, much less 1.5. So what our strategy is, and what we believe is the best thing to do for the world, is to make the transition such that we can continue to use oil and gas, and continuing the use of oil and gas provides the funds that we need and provides the world with a lower cost of fuel for a longer period of time. It enables those countries that have the oil and gas resources to continue producing, to build their economies to the point where they have the same quality of life as those of us who live in Europe or the United States and Middle East. So we have to think about them and what's happening to them as we go. The other thing we have to think about is ensuring that we provide fuel, and natural gas is a great fuel to do it, to those people in countries where they don't have any other source of cooking, and, a way to cook their food. So, and Saudi Arabia has an initiative now to try to get alternative forms of cooking for people who are now dying prematurely because they're cooking with wood inside their homes or huts or whatever they're living in. So there are a lot of benefits to using and continuing to develop oil and gas. The reason it works is because it takes generally more CO2 injected into the reservoir than the incremental barrels that CO2 causes to be produced will emit when those barrels are used. So it's more CO2 going in. When the barrels come out, less CO2 from those barrels. So the calculation is good for sequestration, especially in inefficient reservoirs, which we used to avoid. Now inefficiency is good because you can get more CO2 sequestration. The other thing that's important about that is that it's been pretty hard for us to impact demand. And so demand means that a lot of other sectors have to get a lot more efficient. That's happening to some degree, but not at the rate and pace that it needs to. And so as long as there's demand for oil and gas, we've got to make the oil and gas in the most low carbon way that we can. So the other thing about CO2 in oil reservoirs is that you can get more barrels out of fields that are already developed. So all the steel and all the equipment that goes into building the infrastructure for an oil and gas development means that has a carbon footprint too. And so you eliminate duplicating that carbon footprint in some other reservoir in some other place. So all of those are benefits to using CO2 in enhanced oil recovery. And so for us, until we get that message out, until people understand that, we're not going to be on the most optimum path toward a just transition for everybody. And with that, I'm timing myself. Went over a little bit, but that's pretty much what I wanted to point out. And I think there needs to be more dialogue around this and more openness to making this happen. And that's why we wanted to roll it out today.
Great, thank you so much, Vicki. And I think it's really important to have these conversations, especially on the Decarbonisation Day here at COP. How can we engage more to find these solutions, and what are the different priorities so that we can build towards that decarbonised economy? Tim, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Olivia, and thank you very much, Vicki, for that great explanation of how you see some of this playing out I wanted to give a quick perspective from the International Energy Agency on some of the things that we're talking about. A couple of weeks ago we released our new World Energy Outlook, and one of the really distinctive findings from that outlook was that within this decade, today's policy settings, in our view, are strong enough to drive an overall peak in fossil fuel demand worldwide. So there is no sustained upside for coal from today's energy crisis. Our outlook for gas is quite a long way down from where it was last year because of high prices, essentially. And oil is eventually, the growth there is tempered by the rise in electric mobility and other factors. And that peak leads us into a different kind of discussion around the future of the energy system. Because where we end up is that you have the coexistence, in a sense, of two systems. You have one which is based on fossil fuels, you have another which is based on clean energy transitions. But what Vicki has pointed out so well is that the division between those two systems is in practice not very precise. I mean, there's a lot you can do to reduce the emissions intensity of some traditional fuels, and there's a lot that needs to be done to build up new value chains for zero carbon fuels at the same time. And what we spend a lot of time thinking about at the IEA is what are the ingredients that then allow you to build up some of these new markets for, in a sense, what becomes premium products in a world that will still need fuels, because electricity can't handle, or clean electricity can't shoulder the burden of decarbonisation all on its own. And that's where we look at different policy levers that could come into play. There are things that policies can do, and there's things that industry can do to push new products into the market. And there is a very important role for building out also the new infrastructure that we're going to need. This is a big coordination problem. I think there is a role for governments there to making sure that we have a well-sequenced rollout of some of the new infrastructure that we'll need for CO2 or for low emissions hydrogen. There's also a role for supporting continued innovation in getting some of these new supplies into the market. But I think there's an incredibly important driver has to come from the demand side as well. So we need to have the first movers who are willing to make a bet on low emissions fuels, who are willing to make a bet on ways of doing innovative things also with carbon. There are different aspects to that, but one that we highlight in particular is the importance of procurement and the mandates of trying to get these products into the market more quickly, but also then the importance of standards. You need to know what you're dealing with when you're having a new product. The language around low carbon fuels is used pretty loosely in many cases. And so if there is to be a thing called a low emissions hydrogen, if there is to be recognition for responsibly produced oil and gas where there's demonstrable effort going into reducing methane leaks, we need to have an evidence base that allows us to feel confident about that. So I think there's a lot more work to be done to provide that foundation upon which this clean fuels market can develop, both in terms of the reduced emissions from, in a sense, traditional sources of production, but also the sorts of zero emissions fuels that we're also going to need in the future. And I think one final point that I'd like to make is that in this conversation, as in many conversations about the future of energy, I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about low emissions hydrogen. And the key issue from my perspective is also to recognize that low emissions hydrogen is not going to be a substitute in international trade for today's oil and gas, for all sorts of reasons. But one of the key reasons is we don't see that it's in any way a substitute for the sorts of revenues that are associated with an international oil and gas trade. The rents are not there. I mean, low emissions hydrogen can be produced in many, many countries around the world. So the real value of a discussion around low emissions hydrogen doesn't just come from that trade. It's also, if you have a competitive advantage in producing low emissions hydrogen, it's not how much you can export, but what can you do with that advantage at home? So how can you leverage that into a source of advantage by producing higher value products, whether that's fertilizers or low emissions manufactured goods? And I think that's really where we also need to be having the conversation about the future of many of these technologies. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. Yes, we're seeing some important initiatives, some important movements, the industry demonstrating some of these things, but what's required to take that to the next step? That's going to need policy, that's going to need international cooperation and recognition of what some of those challenges are and how we can overcome them together. But yes, thank you so much. Now I would like to turn to our panel for today to dive a bit deeper into this discussion. Great. Thank you so much. So, Julio, maybe we can start with you. What do you see as some of the most promising technologies that will be needed to see the transformation of the energy trade market and see this zero carbon future? What is it that you're seeing? What is some helpful technologies? And also, what are some of the policies that will be needed to take those to the next stage?
All right. Hello? Hello? There we go. Okay. Yeah, small topics for a 2-minute response, you know. So, what are the technologies, policies, and global markets? Let me start by saying the technologies are not the important part right now. Things like direct air capture are coming along. Things like truly electric Haber-Bosch process are coming along. But that's not what's really limiting progress for a zero carbon energy market today. And that's great. I spent most of my career working on technology. I don't have to do that anymore. We are most of where we need to be on this. I spent the last 5 years working on policy, thinking that was where we needed to be. We have most of the policy we need too. Not all of it. There's ways the policy can improve, but we have a lot of what we need. There are 3 things we don't have that actually I'm deeply worried about, because everybody's got a great picture for 2060, and I'm very optimistic. They don't have a great picture for 2025. Or 2030. And so I'm focused on 3 things in the near term that are problematic and I think we need. The first one is just money. And by money, I mean not incentives. We have the incentives. We don't have offtakes. We don't have purchase for low carbon fuels. Until we have those things, it's going to be hard to build a facility and finance the project. And I personally believe we're going to see a lot of low carbon hydrogen going into a lot of low carbon steel mills. Those steel mills aren't built, those hydrogen contracts aren't written. Until they get there, it's going to be tough to make that happen. So that's one of it. Like, engineers like getting paid in dollars, not hugs. So we got to move things along. Second thing, infrastructure. We think this is going to happen, but we are moving a completely new class of molecules. Like Tim was saying, these are finished products. It's not crude you're shipping around. And hydrogen and ammonia and methanol and sustainable aviation fuel are different things, made in different facilities for different markets. And so it is not just you swap out one thing easily. There's a lot that needs to get done to make that happen. And we don't have the pipelines or the ports or the electric infrastructure or the CO2 pipelines. We don't have any real aspect of the infrastructure we need. The last thing I'll say is we are desperately short on human capital. This is the thing that keeps me up at night. We do not have welders and electricians. We do not have people to permit these things within agencies. We do not have the tax equity lawyers who are pulling together deals. Every aspect of a zero carbon future needs a human being at the helm, and we don't have those people. I have ideas about how to fix that, but to close, whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic, the work looks the same. We all know what we got to do, but we need to keep our eyes on how challenging this truly is.
Great, thank you, Julio. Simon, turning to you now. Obviously, we've seen a lot of MOU activities taking place. We had the IRENA projections. What is it that you're most hopeful about? What is it you're hoping to see? And what are some of the policies that you think will be needed to turn some of those recent MOU activities into policies that will help to start contributing to building this new market?
Thank you very much, Olivia. Yes, IRENA has seen a lot of activity in MOUs recently. And of course, this is a very positive signal to show the way toward realizing the targets. And of course, we are today at COP. We are working with countries, low income, middle income countries, and working with them, we realize we don't have a lot of time. So one of the very important aspects is now to turn those MOU into an actual opportunity that the country can realize. Many countries have included power solution, fuels in their NDCs toward 2030, but the matter of fact, we are now 8 years toward realizing those targets. So 8 years, it's a very short time when you're, sorry,
Yeah.
8 years is a very short time to realizing the infrastructure and the project behind. So very importantly for us today is to make really that governments support the private sector to realize those opportunities. Countries also access to finance, climate finance, because a lot of the plans are conditional to financing. And of course, accelerating, you mentioned permitting, but also everything related to consent, allocation of seabed, of land, that will accelerate and realize and maybe make a milestone. Where are we at 2030? And of course, the policy behind will really pave the way toward more trade and more fuels in the future.
Thank you. So Yukihiro, turning to you, Japan was one of the first countries to issue a hydrogen strategy back in 2017, which is quite far ahead of some of the rest of the world. So what do you see from Japan's side that is needed to move this energy mix? What incentives is Japan got underway to help kickstart this market, and how do you see this moving? We've had the recent MOU activity between Japan and some of the Middle Eastern countries. What do you see as the next step, and what are some of the initiatives that Japan is looking at to build this future?
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm glad that Japan was kind of the first mover for the hydrogen. Yes, that's true. We have organized the first hydrogen ministerial in 2017. And that's similar to the LNG market, because Japan is not connected to pipeline but for the gas producer and us, and that's why we have invested a kind of LNG infrastructure in the past. Now the LNG is now a global market. So what we hope is that the hydrogen could be similar to that. And also another zero carbon. Another carbon fuel we are paying attention is fuel ammonia, because again, Japan is of course announced the carbon neutrality by 2050, and we have also announced ambitious 2030 target, which is a 46% reduction by 2030, and then that's why we needed to recreate our energy mix. And before, we didn't have hydrogen or ammonia in the energy mix, but now, again, under the ambitious target, we have, of course, increased the target of the renewable, and we keep the 20% nuclear power generation mix, and also inputted 1% of hydrogen and ammonia to our energy mix. So this is the first time that we have ammonia hydrogen in our energy mix. But again, there are many challenges. Of course, first challenge is, of course, the cost. But also, as you said, infrastructure regionally or globally is important. This is, again, similar to the LNG. Because, as you said, we have the MOU with the Asian country like Indonesia or Australia. And because they can produce kind of the carbon-free hydrogen with CCUS and also carbon-free ammonia. So that anyway, we need to have a cooperation with that kind of country, especially within Asia. So the new initiative that our Prime Minister is proposing is so-called Asia Zero Emission Community Initiative. We call it AZEC. And the idea is, again, within Asian region, we aim for the zero emission together with the producing country and our country who need such kind of zero emission fuel. That's the idea. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. I just wondered if we could pick a little bit back up on some of the points you were making there. In terms of the financing and the policy support, the cooperation, do you see that that's happening? What is it that you're most hopeful about? What do you want to see more of? And where is some of are those conversations happening? And what is the next step to unlock more of that on both a financing and policy level?
Well, it's always chicken and an egg. I'm more in charge of the industrial decarbonization, and still need hydrogen for the new carbon zero or steel making process. And but so that to do that, we need a lot of investment, of course. And but to invest in large scale, we need to be sure that the carbon-free hydrogen comes from the developing from the other country and so on. So that the issue is whether we can satisfy our demand by supply. So we need a confidence. So I think that's kind of the cooperation between producer and demand side is needed. And what government can do is, of course, need to play a role. And of course, we need, for example, many incentive, subsidy or something, and we need to address the price gap between the current fuel and new fuel. That's what we need to approach it. And also, what I believe the importance for business side is that stability of the policy, how government can support to the business. So that's what we are now doing is we are trying to compile the kind of roadmap for the green transformation in each sector, of course, in hydrogen, ammonia, or steel, and so on, and how Japanese government can support for that, for example, by approaching such kind of a gap of the price, and also how we can support infrastructure and so on. So again, one thing is, policy stability to support for that kind of zero carbon fuel.
Thank you so much. Arshad, EPRI is looking to drive innovation and public access to energy across the world. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the things you're seeing and some of the current priorities? And what do you think is needed to drive more collaboration around this?
Well, first, thank you for having me here today. Just a little bit about EPRI. So we have around 1,500 researchers that works with more than 400 energy companies across 40 countries to drive innovation in deployment. And our research and what I'm going to say is based on the reality of what we see today and the realities of tomorrow. So start with a little bit of pessimism. Vicki mentioned that the demand for oil and gas hasn't abated. So in 2000, 22 years ago, 80% of the energy that the world used was fossil fuel. After 22 years and after a lot of COP and a lot of renewables and a lot of nuclear, 80% of the energy that we use today in the world is fossil fuel. So that's based on pessimism, but let's look forward. The challenge that you mentioned, 2050, 2060, 2070 goals are easy to say. 2030 is hard to achieve. So let's look at one 2030 goal, US, let's look at the US side. Our President Biden is going to speak this afternoon or at 5:15 p.m. And the Biden administration made a pledge that target for US by 2030 is economy-wide reduction of 50% compared to 2005 level. So let me give you some numbers. In 2005, the energy-related US emission was 6 gigaton. Now it is 5 gigaton. Took us roughly, use a round number, 16 years to reduce 1 gigaton. To take the 6 to 50% down, we got to get 6 to 3, which means we still got 2 gigaton left and 8 years left. Do your math. We did 1 in 16, and that 1 was done predominantly in the power sector, oil to gas conversion, wind and solar. Now we got to do 2 gigaton reduction in 8 years. You absolutely cannot achieve that unless transportation industry starts playing its role. Let's talk about optimism now. The optimism is when those targets were set last year at COP26 in Glasgow, in just 1 year, the single largest down payment for deployment of clean energy has been made in US, and that's the Infrastructure Reduction Act. And $6 billion on hydrogen hubs. So we see tremendous activities that has now backing from policy moving forward that will help us to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors. But this decade, the focus needs to be, if we have any prayer to reach the targets that different countries have set, significant amount of transportation electrification. So if you look at McKinsey, if you look at Bain, if you look at EPRI analysis, for US to reach 50%, we're looking at 6 to 7 cars out of 10 new cars sold in US in 2030 has to be electric. We are looking at industrial sector that really hasn't reduced their emission except through energy efficiency will need to reduce at least 10 to 15%. How do you do that? If you look at the level of hydrogen that we need, the liquid ammonia that we need, it is going to be a challenge this decade to reach even what has been committed in Glasgow. And end up with the other side of decarbonization. There was a study that came out in Nature magazine that says that even if we reach that target of 2030 and we go 2050 net zero, our glide path, we're looking at 2.1 to 2.9 degrees C rate, temperature rise. So we got to make sure the energy system today can withstand the weather of tomorrow, because the weather has changed, will change. Hopefully we can slow that change, but resiliency needs to be also a big part on a net zero future.
Great. Thank you so much for these really important comments. And as we mentioned, 80%, we're still in this 80% of unabated fossil energy. We're still in the same place. Julio, maybe I could bring you in here. Why are we still here? What is needed? And how can we see more activity in the hard-to-abate sectors? I know you've done a lot of work in the Middle East, North Africa. Perhaps maybe what the role there is, and is the producers and the importing side having the conversations that are needed, and what policies can help to unlock more of this activity?
So America's most famous bank robber was a guy named Willie Sutton. And when asked why he robbed banks, he said, that's where the money is. We should be focusing on the MENA region because that's where the carbon is. Same thing with the Gulf of Mexico, the Permian Basin, that's where the carbon is. If you want to reduce carbon emissions, go where the carbon is. That's the opportunity space. And in point of fact, while, I have good days and bad days, I'm broadly optimistic about the work because we have all the tools we need. Part of what we need, I think, there is no substitute for leadership. Japan's leadership has been extraordinary. The IRA is extraordinary leadership. Corporate leadership has been extraordinary too, not the least of which under Vicki's. But we simply need more. That's just the way the arithmetic is penned out. Towards this, the thing that I feel good about, again, is we basically have the technology and most of the policies we need. So if we can tackle these other problems, we can make a lot of progress. There's a couple of things I would put in that bin. One of them, to the other speaker's comment, the solution to chicken and egg problems is always the same: chickens. We cannot build huge numbers of clean hydrogen or clean fuels plants, but we can build a few, like the hybrid plant. As soon as the hybrid plant was built and operated, all of its volume was sold. This is the zero carbon steel mill in Sweden. BMW and Volvo bought all of it, okay? GM will not buy zero carbon steel until it's in the market. So you need to make a few of these things to train workforce to get some stuff going. In this, there's an underused government policy, which is procurement. Governments buy 60% of the concrete in the world, 20% of the steel in the world, and 5% of the fuels. Governments can do a lot in terms of providing price certainty and market firmness for some of these things. In the same way that they have created incentives, those incentives are largely covering the cost. If they provide just surety with the contracts, then you'll actually get a long way. The last thing I'll say to your point, like should we be thinking about other regions, I think we are undervaluing the opportunity to cooperate around the world. Top of that for me is actually setting standards, something that was said earlier. If we have standards for carbon content, that helps. If we have standards for what is low carbon ammonia, that helps. But also standards for clean steel, also standards for clean ammonia. If we start making these standards in terms of how they're made, then within the sectors, a small number of countries and a small number of companies can really drive the agenda. So it doesn't have to be a global compact. You can get 5 nations and 5 companies pulling in the same direction and creating the supply chains and precedents that are necessary. That, by the way, also moves organizations like the IMO out of their current position into one where they can become more optimistic and more favorable to other alternatives.
Thank you, Julio. Simon, I guess IRENA is headquartered in the Middle East and obviously has a very global presence, so has an eye on all of this. Perhaps I can put a similar question to you. What do you think is needed? How can we ensure here that we're seeing both the renewables build out that is needed for the direct electrification of the grid, also the surplus to produce the green hydrogen? We also need the volumes. So we need climate controls for the blue hydrogen as well, so that we can start to see that scaling. What are you seeing on the production side? What are you seeing on the import side? Are things moving in the right direction? What can we do to see more infrastructure? What can we do to unlock more financing and drive some of these policies to start seeing this scale?
Yes, IRENA is headquartered in the UAE, and of course we've seen a number of announcements related to coupling renewable generation with to produce green hydrogen. I think when we looked in detail at the opportunity outlined in this announcement, we see that people need to really realize what matters to really drive those projects. First, you need to build the project where there is the most resource potential. So when you're talking about solar, really need to focus on what are the high potential locations to build and build those solar power plants. Secondly, you need to consider also the bottlenecks. For example, transmission distribution. If you cannot produce hydrogen exactly where the solar power plant is there, you need to consider that. And of course, a lot of countries today have identified improvement potential in terms of transmission and distribution. Lastly, of course, what is important as well is when we're shifting from government to private actors, the cost of capital matters. So we see a differential between developed country where we see low cost of capital, 3-4%, and emerging market where the cost of capital is extremely high, meaning the developers need to finance it in a more complex way. So for example, when we see the pipeline of projects that have been announced, only a fraction, around 10% today, has what we call the bankability criteria for coupling renewable generation to produce green hydrogen.
Thank you. Arshad, I wondered if we could turn to you. Julio mentioned that we have the toolkit. We know we have a lot of these technologies, and we know how to do this. What do you see as needed to deploy that toolkit and to deploy some of these technologies and build out some of this infrastructure? Do you think this is well understood? And what is the next step in order to start seeing these technologies deployed?
That's a 1-minute answer to a very tough question. So if you look at, there are easy to abate sectors that we need to focus on today. Hard to abate sectors, we should do the innovation today to be ready for tomorrow. Easy to abate sectors, energy efficiency throughout the economy. Energy efficiency has been the best tool in the toolbox for residential, commercial, industrial, and even in the power sector to reduce the energy consumption. So we need to supercharge energy efficiency. Second, the electric sector needs to continue to need to be clean. I mentioned in the US almost 40% clean electric sector from 2005 to 2022, but there's still ways to go. And that's where significant amount of wind, significant amount of solar, this decade will make a difference, but then you need the grid to make that happen. So I mentioned in the US to meet the 50% target, we will need at least 600 to 800 gigawatt of wind and solar. Today we have 220. So we have to build transmission at 3 times to 4 times the pace than we have built in the past. Do we have the permitting capability? Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the workforce? So I think those are near-term challenges that we will have to overcome. But long-term, just give you one example of where I think collaboration really makes sense. Last year at the Glasgow COP, Accenture, World Economic Forum, and EPRI, we launched this net zero industrial cluster movement. And today there are 11 clusters worldwide. And the 11 cluster is a place where co-located energy companies and industries are in the same place. Those 11 clusters are 350 million ton of CO2, and they have all committed to work together, because one of the biggest challenges, not technology, is how do you have a CO2 pipeline or CCS that is supporting 5 competing industry? How do you have a hydrogen or steam production that's supplying to 6 different industries that are co-located? So I think the net zero industrial cluster and bringing the clusters together, US, Spain, UK, Netherlands, China, and Australia is where those clusters are. And we expect by 2025 at least 50 clusters. And they can share the results of both what technology works in which region, how do you do the framework of agreement for energy to be shared by different industries. And I think that type of collaboration would be essential for the hard-to-abate sectors.
Great, thank you, Arshad. And I want to pick up on the point of hubs and the industrial clusters, where we're seeing these different technologies, both the carbon capture, the renewables, the infrastructure, the zero carbon fuels, all work together to abate emissions, and how we do that in the most economic way. So Simon, maybe we could go to you here. How do you see the role of these highly industrialized nations in being able to develop these projects, develop these hubs, and demonstrate these clusters? What do you see as their role in terms of scaling this and demonstrating these technologies so that we can have these learning points and these policy best practices figured out, so that we can begin to see this go to other nations as well?
Yes, I think that's a very good point. I think we're here today for discussion between the highly developed economies and the developing world. And of course, the topic of technology transfer has been for a long time at the center of the Paris Agreement. So those hubs are fundamental, because this is where, you mentioned China, India, the US, this is where the cost of, for example, green hydrogen will be the lowest. So this is where the maturity of the technology will increase. So this is where you can experiment, increase the efficiency, reduce the cost of, for example, the electrolyzers, and then start a discussion with the developing country on how they can integrate those developed solutions at a high maturity level into their plans. Because of course, those countries, when you ask them what they want, they don't want to experiment themselves. They want to really integrate those solutions and build the hubs, build the ports to drive the economies. So we see a potential to create alliance. For example, discussion between the North and the South regarding what does it make to create an industry around a specific technology. We see also discussion between South-South discussion. For example, we see in Africa, South Africa and Egypt discussion on hydrogen, very interesting ones. And of course, the discussion of reducing the access, increasing the access to finance is important. The developed country needs to give a signal that the portion of climate finance will be allocated to those sectors that need to be abated to realize the very ambitious climate targets.
Great, thank you. I think Julio wants to come in here
Just
as well.
very briefly, super fast follow-up. Hubs are also a place where you can develop human capital, period. That's where you have a trained workforce, where you can train additional workforce, and that can also be a province of exchange, where a country like Chile that's going to be a world leader in this can actually train a workforce that's global as part of their mission.
Thank you, Julio. And did you want to share any insights here on how you're seeing hubs moving and some of the policies and infrastructure? You talked about unlocking that financing, unlocking that infrastructure. How are you seeing hubs moving around the world, and what can we do to see more?
So one of the things we're learning with hubs is that they're hard. Because it takes a lot of parties. There's a lot of stakeholders, there's a lot of hand-holding, there's a lot of getting to yes. That's okay, actually. That's really important work to do. In order to build an industrial hub, you should have a lot of buy-in. That makes it strong, that makes it resilient. But these things take time, actually. So what the hubs that are coming forward, just take one recent example with the Department of Energy hubs. I think their initial vision was, have a big competition, go. What they realized is they need time to actually allow stakeholders to develop a joint vision, to build a better team, to figure out who's going to do what, to make sure they have the approvals. And so the starting with like the hydrogen hubs with a letter of intent, I think was actually very, very smart, because it gave more groups the opportunity to figure out what they wanted to do and gave more groups the opportunity to proceed forward. The same thing basically happened with the UK competitions. It was really, lots of stakeholders working together. So the thing that I'm not worried about in the hubs, amazingly, is the money. It seems like the money is actually in place for these things. There's enough government money and there's enough private money to get the hubs off the ground if they can figure out how to get to yes.
Great, thank you, Julio. And then Arshad, maybe I can bring you back in here on the hubs point. Obviously, we are seeing this move. Julio mentioned that the financing isn't an issue. Do you agree with these reflections? What are you seeing? And also, how about hubs in the developing world?
Well, this is a new concept. It's emerging. I'll talk about the Houston hub that was just formed a couple of months ago as the largest user and producer of hydrogen today. Now, those hydrogen are not clean hydrogen, but that is where the largest user and producers are. The Humber hub in UK, and that's looking at renewable hydrogen, CCS hydrogen, and if their goal by 2030, the Humber in UK is basically reduce enough emission that's equivalent to 12.5 million cars getting off the street. I think the hub work, we got more than, 10 people working full-time now in US just to coalesce the different hubs that are coming in. Some of the hubs have 50, 60 organizations. And now the question is, who does what? Once you do the framework, what is the technology? Is it going to be CCS? And if it's CCS or hydrogen, this is a work that will take time. And for this work to have an impact on emission reduction, we think beyond 2030 is what we need to be focusing on, real emission reduction. But as we are working on these hubs, we cannot lose sight that if we fail to reduce the emission by 2030, that we committed last year in Glasgow, it will have a long, long impact in our journey toward decarbonization. So I always bring us back to do the easy to abate now, show we can do it. Show that transportation can reduce 20% emission. Show that industry can reduce 20% emission. Show that electricity can go from 40% down to 70% down. Because if we got only 8 more years, 7.5 more years to go. So I think both hard to abate sectors and not losing our focus on what we need to do this decade, both are needed for us to remain optimistic about a zero carbon future.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
just very quickly, we would be remiss if we did not mention yesterday's announcement of the Jubail hub, that Saudi Arabia has pledged to a 9 million ton a year hub by 2025 and a 40 million ton a year hub by 2030. That's extraordinary and shows the kind of speed and scale that is possible if we can tie our shoes.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that, Julio. So I just wanted to open up the floor in case there were any questions for our panelists. Yeah?
There seems to be this magic number of 80%. So what's the view on the panel why 2030? How much will be oil and gas based and how much will be renewable by 2030?
I have no prediction.
We'll tell you in 2030. The analysis that we have done, and this is a very US-focused analysis, if we are very aggressive in electrification of transportation, because industries we don't see in the next 8 years making any major impact. But if we are really aggressive, we may be at 70% in 2030. But that is if we are really aggressive.
Yeah, thanks for the comments. If we look at the scenarios for 2050 in terms of 1.5 degrees, we are talking about 5 billion tons of CO2 being captured and stored. 5 billion tons. If we look at these hubs, 50 million tons that Julio mentioned, we need at least 100 of those around the world. So you mentioned people, the welders, but we need also the people from subsurface sciences, because you need to have the understanding of where the CO2 is going and so on. So what we need to do is scale up in terms of the subsurface sciences, in which are today in petroleum engineering. So we need to be able to use those skills.
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. If only there was an industry that understood how to move fluids in the subsurface, you know. We have that industry. And in fact, that industry today moves about 5 billion tons of stuff. And so we certainly can do that volume with a good place to start. Vicki, you're the expert on this, so.
Well, no, the thing I wanted to point out is until we get a certification process so that we truly understand the intensity of all of these industries, and until, I don't know what oil company was a part of putting the clusters together, but if you didn't have one, I wouldn't be surprised, because we've got to find a way to certify. Once we certify, then we can do the math better on what do we need to do, when, and how fast. And I don't see that today.
Houston, it was Shell. And Vicki, maybe a question to you. What do you think will be that 80% in 2030? You're in the oil and gas industry.
Sorry?
What will be that 80% in 2030?
What will be the 80%?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that fossil fuels will still be a big part of it. I mean, I think it's by 2030, we don't have time to really do the other things we need to do. You look at the supply chain issues, that's going to linger for the next couple of years. So the production of rare earth minerals that goes into a lot of the things that need to be developed. So if you're talking about making EVs, yeah, we can make EVs, but what we can't do is make the supply chain zero carbon.
The one thing I'll add is actually to this other question, we may not be able to change the fossil fuel mix a lot. We may not be able to defossilize, especially things like heavy industry, but we can certainly decarbonize them. And that is something that all the people in this room are actually passionately committed about. The only thing that matters to me is the arithmetic of the atmosphere. If we get the tons down, that's a win.
Yeah, absolutely, Julio. I think the conversation as well really needs to be focused on moving from the unabated fossil fuels as well, and how we can look to decarbonize that too. Meg, go ahead.
The panel you mentioned hydrogen and ammonia. Do you have an opinion about e-fuels?
I certainly have an opinion about e-fuels, yes. So for starters, e-fuels are coming. And hydrogen's going to be the first e-fuel, but it's not going to be the last. We're going to see a lot of e-methanol coming online, and we're going to see other synthetic fuels made with electrosynthesis. For real. It'll take a while, but one of our little portfolio companies, 12, just sold 25 million gallons of e-fuels to JetBlue. So there's volumes that are coming in a very real way. I will say that in order to do e-fuels, you need a whole lot of E. We need huge volumes of super cheap, super abundant, low-carbon electricity to get that done. And there is a reasonable question as to the prioritization of these things. But again, I'm a bouillabaisse kind of guy. Like, we just got to throw it all in there. And we definitely need those. If so, two quick thoughts. One of them is we absolutely need additional incentives to get there, because the current policy framework actually does not deliver e-fuels in the way it needs to on many fronts. The other thing I was going to say is if you look at the stack of incentives under IRA for sustainable aviation fuels, this is 45V, 45Q, 40B, 45Z, 48C. If you sort of stack all of these things up, Some sustainable aviation fuel pathways, including the e-fuel pathways, come in at negative costs. So that's nice, and something that will hopefully help stimulate industries not just in the US, but more broadly.
Maybe just to add one trend that we are seeing is where it's hard to build transmission, but there is a lot of wind and a lot of sun. You do a complete off-grid renewables and use liquid ammonia as the transportation because you cannot build transmission. So there is an opportunity in the future where not all the renewables will be on-grid, but there will be renewables produced off-grid and liquid ammonia be the transport carrier. In essence, liquid ammonia is the transmission line that you couldn't build. So that's something that we're keeping an eye on. And there is quite a bit of potential of that at a very low cost of electricity.
Well, Japan's betting on exactly this. I mean, right? I would love to get your thought on this point. But it is important to note that ammonia is not hydrogen either. You can't turn ammonia into jet fuel. Ammonia cracking is going to be a bigger part of our world than I think most people realize.
Do you want to weigh in here? Okay. Okay, so I think we have actually come to time now, and wanted to thank everyone for this very lively and informative discussion. And now I'll try to do a summary of this topic. So we've heard we need volumes, we need financing, we have the toolkit, we know what's there, we're seeing innovation, we're seeing movement, we're seeing hubs, we're seeing some of the financing being made available. We need the infrastructure, we need to have these conversations cross-sectoral, across governments. We need to pull the emitters into the conversation so that we can find solutions and pick that low-hanging fruit. This is hard, options will be needed, so we need to start with the easy-to-abate stuff first. So what the will is there, the global community has their eyes on this, but now we need to start to see that move from that 80% of unabated fossil fuel today. So with that, I think I will close and hope that you all stay around for some more conversations afterwards. Thank you.